like if people are considering moving overseas and they hear, oh, I heard about this job in like Budapest or in Paris or in the Ukraine or in Tokyo or in Sao Paulo, odds are with the AMI network, we know somebody at that school or who has worked at that school. So it would be a nice network to plug in to.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the good fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. Are you planning to travel with your group sometime soon? If so, please consider my sponsor, Kaleidoscope Adventures, a full-service tour company specializing in student group travel. With a former educator as its CEO, Kaleidoscope Adventures is dedicated to changing student lives through travel, and they offer high-quality service and an attention to detail that comes from more than 25 years of student travel experience. Trust Kaleidoscope's outstanding staff to focus on your group's one-of-a-kind adventure so that you can focus on everything else. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio-on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you knew one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. Before I introduce my next guest, Jay Londgren, I want to take a moment to talk about what you're about to hear. Jay is a band director at the Singapore American School, and so during the course of this interview, we had a great deal of lag between our conversation, and so it was several seconds before Jay could hear me, and several seconds before I could hear Jay. So I let him talk, and the answers are longer than usual, and so I'm going to leave as much of the interview in place with a minimum of editing, just so that you can understand what we were trying to talk about. But Jay is a really interesting person and gives some really, really interesting insight on the decisions and the experiences that he's had teaching abroad. And now on to my next guest, Jay Londgren. Hi, Jay.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for joining me. You're quite the unique guest in the list, and so I should probably ask you to introduce yourself and explain why I'm saying that for my listeners.
Yeah, so my name is Jay Lundgren, and I am currently the high school band director at Singapore American School in Singapore, which I think that puts us about 10,000 miles apart through the magic of the internet.
So, Jay, can you tell the listeners your origin story? How'd you get into music, and what was that like in your early years as a child?
So early on, it is actually it's I think maybe a bit of a surprise to my family that I ended up as a music teacher because nobody in my immediate family would, I think, describe themselves as musical. My mom from my perspective, she plays piano quite well, but she had no formal training. She plays everything by ear. But I was raised in rural Minnesota. My dad's a farmer. I went to a relative to some of the size schools that I've seen, now out in my career, of fairly small rural high school, but that was blessed with a very, very quality music program. And I was definitely a beneficiary of that. But when people ask this question of my parents, like, how did your son become interested in music? My mom tells this story of when I was very, very small, and they were going to take me to a movie, and they knew it was a Disney movie, and they didn't know too much else about it. And the movie was Fantasia. And apparently, I think the day we were supposed to go, my mom found out from a colleague that, there wasn't actually a plot to the movie. It was just, cartoons and music. And she was concerned because I had this kind of reputation in my family. Literally, I had a nickname in my family as, the White Tornado, because I had very, very blonde hair and I didn't like to sit still. I was running around all over the place and just interested and always on the move. And so my mom told me she was kind of concerned going into the theater because, if there wasn't a story, she's worried that, within the first few minutes I would get, I'd start squirming and, just be a bit of a distraction to everybody else in the theater. And to her surprise, she said, once the movie started, I didn't move. She said, she said, I'd never seen you sit still that long in your entire life. And so I guess that was the first early indication. But I kind of just did the normal band thing. We started in grade 6. And for grade 6, grade 7, grade 8, and grade 9, I ended up with a different band director every year, because the lady that I started with, I was a member of her last group, and then she retired, and then they had an interim director when I was in grade 7, and then when I was in grade 8, they had another new director, a full-time director, and then I moved to the high school in grade 9, and so met another new director. And I immediately, when you asked the question of, how did you, start really thinking about music seriously, I always come back to two stories. The first is my 8th grade band director, Mr. Marks. I really need to look him up and make sure he knows this story, because I think I really owe him a debt on this one, because up until grade 8, band was pretty easy. It was kind of a low stakes environment. Some people practiced, some people didn't, and it was kind of like, at least before he showed up, it was kind of one of those: if you show up and make some sort of effort, you're pretty much guaranteed an A in the class. And then he arrived, and I kind of it was business as usual, or so I thought, and my grade was not what I was used to it being. I think I had a B or something. And I went into his office and I asked the question, and this is what I will never forget. I said, "Mr. Marks, I noticed that I don't have an A in band." I said, "Am I missing something?" And he looked at me and deadpan, he said, "Yep, just practice. You're just missing practice." And I was like, I had nothing to say, because he was absolutely right. And I was like, oh. And of course, my mom insists that I tell the rest of the story, because my 8th grade self was like, I got a bit offended and was like, my initial reaction was like, well, I don't want to be here. So I told my mom, I was like, I don't think I want to be in band. And she's like, yeah, no, you're going to stay. I think she was very appreciative of, him being honest, which is something I remember as a teacher. And then definitely my one of my biggest role models for my entire high school was my high school band director. And my very first lesson with her is I really think it was a key moment in my musical career, because I was a saxophone player initially, and she had kind of this reputation. She was not a very tall lady, but she was one of these, forces of nature type directors. Very soft spoken, but and it was a small enough school where everybody was kind of involved in everything, because you had to be. So like our trombone section was also the starting line of the football team type of thing, and so it was just we didn't really have people that were just athletes or just musicians, or it was kind of you did multiple things because it was small enough. But I did know that like the football team was scared of her. Like they're like, if one of the linemen missed a lesson, he would not want to go in and like ask for forgiveness. So I was this little freshman, and I'm coming in for my very first lesson, and I'm kind of terrified. And I had practiced because Mr. Marks had made an impact. So I in retrospect, I was ready for the lesson. And we were going through, and about maybe 10 minutes into the lesson, she asked me a kind of a similar question to what you just asked, just tell me a little bit about yourself. And she said, how come you're so musical? And that was the first time anyone had ever suggested to me that I was musical. It has just never been an adjective that I had used to describe myself. And I was like, I don't remember what I said back, but I do remember that kind of lightning bolt moment of, oh, I had never really considered that. And that was kind of the start of, she kind of got my attention. And if I had ever met anyone who led by example, she was just an absolutely brilliant musician and brilliant human. I mean, she's retired. She's still around. Her name's Monica Castle. And just a huge influence over who I am today as a musician and as a person. So much so that I ended up going to the same university she did, which is Luther College down in Iowa. So, And so from that, kind of small moment in ninth grade, I kept getting more and more and more involved. And it was, again, small school thing. So, we had a tuba player that graduated. And so she's like, I need other people to learn new instruments so we have decent instrumentation. So I was one of the volunteers that I switched from saxophone to tuba and learned bass guitar. So we had a bass player for the jazz band and kind of just would end up jumping around and playing what was needed, which I thought was very fun. And which ended up serving me quite well in methods classes later on, because I had asked her, I think in grade, because then so by about grade 10, a year or so after that, I had really seriously started considering that music teaching might be what I really wanted to do, because it was definitely where I felt the most at home on campus. I felt like I was contributing the most. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the work. And so I asked Ms. Castle, if I wanted to go into music education, like, what do you recommend that I do now? And thank goodness for her, because she recommended even though I was 16, she said, start piano lessons. And if you get a chance, try to take some lessons on some different instruments, just so you can understand how woodwinds work and how woodwinds think, and understand how brass players work and how they think. And I even took a couple years of violin lessons. No one would ever want to hear me play violin, but I at least kind of understand the struggles of string players. And my piano teacher, I think, would be my second biggest influence, because I came. Most of her students were elementary students, and she had a couple of students that she was able to retain. But a lot of people would, they would study through grade 6 or grade 7, and then life would pull them away. And she was, kind of curious at this 16-year-old kid coming and saying, I don't know where middle C is really, but I'm willing to learn. And so she did. In retrospect, an amazing thing for me. She made sure that I was her last lesson on Monday. So I think my lesson was, I want to say it was 6 to 7 was our, or it might have even been supposed to have been 6 to 6:30, but she always made sure I was at the end. And then after the lesson was over, she would either take out a basic music theory book, and we would do the state music theory exams, or she would just start going through her LP collection of have you listened? She's initially you do know the Beethoven symphonies, right? And then, what do you know? Respighi? Do you know Rachmaninoff? Do you know? And so she would just start playing, these major works that she thought, if you want to teach music, you should start with the best. And there were times when I wouldn't leave her house till 9, and she would never charge my parents for more than the hour lesson. And there were times where she'd have me over on Saturday mornings for theory breakfasts, where we would, do ear training exercises over, oatmeal. So, absolutely amazing woman, still teaching too. Really, really cool. And so from there, it was just kind of an upward trajectory into Luther. And up until Luther, I was kind of assuming I would be, a high school band director or a middle school, high school band director in Minnesota somewhere. And then Luther is where the first international connection happened. So, yeah, so that's kind of the I guess the early years.
So I guess what I want to know is so that to me is the most interesting thing. So what happened at Luther to kind of push you towards that international teaching career?
So I had an education professor. His name's Jim Langholtz. And before he became a professor of education, he actually taught overseas at various international schools for, I want to say it was about 25 years. And then his kind of next phase in his career was to, he pursued the doctorate, and then he wanted to train teachers. But he had such a good experience teaching overseas, and he felt so few people knew about it as an option, that he thought, what would be really interesting is if we could get some of our student teachers here at Luther to have kind of a little taste of what it's like to teach overseas. And so a lot of his friends that he had made when he was an overseas teacher, their career path took them into administration. So he was friends with a lot of principals and a lot of superintendents at various international schools around the world. And he's a very, very charming guy. And he'll do anything for you. So you feel like you want to return the favor. And he got student teaching placements, I want to say, in 10 different countries by the time he left. as available options for not just music teachers but all, all subjects, elementary. So if you were in teacher training at Luther, you had the option to spend half of your time student teaching in another country. And I took him up on the offer, and this weird circular nature of my career, I student taught in the classroom that I'm currently speaking to you from. And I spent half of my time student teaching in Singapore and the other half in rural Iowa, which was familiar enough to me because of being from rural Minnesota. It made sense, but it was definitely a very, I won't say jarring, but it was the two experiences were like polar opposites, like large, very large international school where I'm just kind of focused on, I was basically high school band, and then I was working with the beginners in 5th grade. And then I got to Riceville and it was K-12, kind of everything, a little bit of band, choir, elementary music, and also just wonderful people, but definitely, polar opposites of the experience perspective. And so the student teaching experience was the kind of my first taste. And I didn't really know it at the time. But within the international world, Singapore American School is pretty well known. And so because I had 2 letters of reference or 2 letters of recommendation in my file from SAS, and my experience in SAS kind of made me realize that international teaching was something I wanted to pursue. So I decided to sign up for, I should probably not assume, most of your listeners might not know kind of how the recruiting process works if you're a teacher in the States interested in working overseas. So I guess I should probably explain that a little bit, and then it'll kind of make sense into how I then got my first full-time job. So I think that'll work. So there are a series of the job fairs for international schools, and I'm not really sure why, but the very first one that ever existed was at the University of Northern Iowa, which is very, very close to Luther, especially on a national scale. So it was the UNI job fair, UNI overseas teaching, teaching overseas job fair. I can't remember the exact official title. But of course, Dr. Langholtz knew everyone that organized that event. And so he helped me get registered. And so I was registered. And it was usually, in most cases, an international school wants their applicants to have at least 2 years of teaching experience, like full-time teaching experience in the States before they would even interview you. But like I said, I had the benefit of having 2 letters of recommendations from Singapore American School. So that definitely got me a lot of interviews. And so it was a very, very surreal weekend because it's set up next to a hotel, and kind of how it works is every school has their hotel room, and then there's the main conference floor. And you can bring your resume to schools, but they've of course got everybody in a file system beforehand. So they're also, you'll go to you have like a little mailbox thing, and there might be an interview request in your file, or they might have contacted you by email beforehand. And so you might be interviewing with a school in Dubai at 10 o'clock, and then there might be a school from Spain at 10:30, and then you might be interviewing at a school in Japan at 11:45, and it's a very fast forward style weekend because the schools have so many openings, and they want to obviously fill as many of them before they leave the fair as possible. So a lot of times you might have actually what I ended up having was, I believe I had by Sunday morning, I had 7 job offers in 7 different countries. And it was a very interesting mix, and it ended up being, it was just fascinating. 5 of them were for full-time elementary music, which I have nothing but respect for people who can do elementary music well. It's not a skill that I really, it was something I could do. And I can see the value of for sure, but it's not something that's definitely in my skill set. So it was like, and then I had another job offer that included, it was elementary music and middle school band, which was, band was definitely where my passion was. And I knew that was something that That was what I wanted to pursue. So I had elementary and middle school at actually a fairly well-known school. And then I had this kind of dark horse offer from a school that I had never heard of in a country that I had not considered at all. It was a school in Venezuela. And their job offer was, well, we're a very small school. We're about, at that time, there were about 130 students total. I mean, preschool 12. And they said, we need a music teacher, like for the entire school. So the job was everything from what, and this is also funny because my understanding of the interview was that it was K-12. And of course, when I arrived, I realized it was preschool 12. So preschool music all the way up to their high school band. And I knew my true passion was for working with high school kids from my experience, because I got to work with high school kids in Riceville, Iowa, and in Singapore. And that was really where I felt the most at home. And so it came down to that was the only job offer I had that would offer me experience with high school kids. And initially, my high school band was 9, which is pretty good because the high school had 24 people in it. There were, I think, my first year, I think there were 2 seniors. We're talking very, very small school. But it was an absolutely amazing experience, and I definitely can say that in retrospect because the first year, and especially the first semester, and this is true of anybody, your first year teaching is just trial by fire. But of course, I'm the only music teacher there, and from my kind of perspective, the only music teacher in that system in the country, and so I definitely felt isolated and was like having I think it was 10 preps. I kind of had definitely a few moments of. Well, what's the step right below a mental breakdown, whatever that would be. But I had absolutely amazing colleagues too. So the other fun thing about the school was there was, I was the only music teacher, but there were a lot of people like that. There was one PE teacher for the whole school. There was one high school English teacher. There was, only one teacher for each of the grade levels. And so everybody helped everybody out. And the faculty that I'm still in touch and still really good friends with faculty members from the school, even though all but 2 of us are no longer in Venezuela. So I credit my colleagues with really helping me through that first year.
Let's break this up and let me ask you a couple questions about that first experience you had. Okay.
Okay.
So, I guess what I want to know is what was that like to finish your degree? I know you had the student teaching in Singapore, but what was that like to finish your degree at Luther and then pack everything up and go to Venezuela? I mean, what was that like for your parents, for your family, for you?
Oh, that's a great question. And it was, I'm sitting here trying to think of, what word would I use? And I'm realizing it was not any one thing. It was exciting. It was exciting and it was terrifying simultaneously. My parents had kind of gotten used to the idea of, because I had started talking about, this overseas teaching idea as far back as my sophomore year at Luther. So they had kind of initially thought it was, on a lark and like, oh no, maybe you would do that for just student teaching. And then you'll come back to Minnesota and find a job. And then they once they realized that the schools were established and it was a thing people did, they were more comfortable with the idea. We were all a little nervous because of Venezuela's perception in the news, and that was that Chavez was still alive at that point. And so flying down there, my Spanish was less than high school. It was a bit nerve-wracking. But then being met at the airport by the principal, like it was just, especially, it was small school, like you come through security and there's your boss and they're ready to take you. And this is, there's definitely several benefits to living overseas. Because the schools understand if you're willing to kind of pack up and move, they do a lot of things to help facilitate that for you. One of the biggest ones is in almost all cases, your housing is taken care of. so you don't have to worry about finding a place to live. The school, depending on the school, they'll either own apartments, they'll have on-campus housing, or they will provide kind of like a housing stipend, and then they'll provide realtor support for you to to find a place to live. And so I was met at security by my boss, who took me in his car and drove me to my apartment that was waiting for me, when I was like his next door neighbor, because the school owned like a block of apartments. And so and it was ups and downs. And I would say I think the other thing that helped is I was not the only person that was hired at that Iowa job fair. There were several other people that also were hired. And after we had all signed our contracts, the superintendent, was it the superintendent or the principal? I think it might have been both. They took us just out to dinner at a local restaurant, so we got to meet each other. And so it was, and then, you're getting on the plane, you're flying there kind of solo, and you're looking for familiar faces. So that next morning when the new faculty all met together for breakfast, you're like, oh, I remember you from Iowa. And then everybody, you're just kind of, everyone's looking for, how do I want to put it? You're looking for lifelines, and you're throwing out lifelines, and like, okay, we've got each other. We're not, you don't feel alone, and then you feel like you've got a support network where you feel backed up. But I do remember, getting on the plane from Miami to Barcelona, Venezuela was a leap of faith, because I was like, well, I hope, and at that point, I don't think I had a smartphone at that point. So it was kind of like, if you hadn't checked your email, and, texting and, internet texting wasn't as ubiquitous as it was now. It was like, well, I hope we got the times right. And there's no really way for me to check because there wouldn't be Wi-Fi at the airport. And so I remember once I saw my boss waving to me through the glass, I was like, okay, it's all good.
Was this in Caracas?
I was at a small school in, it's kind of a double town, Puerto La Cruz and Barcelona. It's kind of similarly set up to like Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's like one city, but they're right next to each other. And the best way I've heard it described is it's like the San Diego of Venezuela. It's kind of known as a kind of a beach town, and very, very laid back atmosphere, and really nice people.
So Jay, what year did you arrive in Venezuela? How long were you there before you decided that you were going to look to another school to move again?
So I arrived in Venezuela in the fall of 2007. And so for most international school, I would say almost all schools that I know of, your initial contract, your initial commitment to a school is 2 years. And that they do that for various reasons, because it costs the school resources to go out and recruit people. And then once they have their people, they have to work through, work visas and assigning housing. And it's a bit of an investment on the part of a school. So they want to have at least, 2 years of service out of you before you move on. And given the nature of my job in Venezuela and kind of the ups and downs of living in a country like Venezuela, I'm proud to say that I survived my 2-year contract and I grew a lot. But I was there for 2 years, and then moved on to South Korea, which there's actually a connection in Venezuela that helped me secure a job in South Korea too, which is another small world story. But like living in Venezuela was kind of what I kind of describe it as a bit like the Wild West. You never really knew what to expect. Other than you would probably have some sort of power outage at some point during most days. Kind of an all-encapsulating story I tell people is towards the first semester of my second year, someone organized a party at their apartment because we were going to celebrate 100 hours of consecutive electricity. It was, we had 100 consecutive hours where nobody lost power. And the party was scheduled in November because it hadn't happened yet. And then of course we get to the party and 30 minutes into the party, the power goes out. So it was like, okay. And we had just things that you would never really think about. Like we would have shortages of various staple goods. Like I do remember there was a time when you could not get milk for several months. And there was and then there was also a shortage of toilet paper for a while. So like when the grocery store got in toilet paper, people would text, like the math teacher was at the grocery store. So he would like buy up, pallets of toilet paper for everybody on staff. And then, and then actually when there was actually a milk truck that arrived at the grocery store in our town, that there's no other way to say this, that it was politely robbed. Like there was kind of a crowd of people that had been so desperate for milk. The driver pulled up and they basically said, "We need the contents of your vehicle, sir." And he's like, there's a big crowd of people, and he just stepped away from the truck and they took the milk and off they went. And you'd be in the middle of a lesson or a rehearsal. If power goes out, if you've got a sound system you're working on, that doesn't work. Band always met in the afternoon, and we would often have to move out into the courtyard for our rehearsals just because we would lose air conditioning. And the band room was an old chapel, because the campus that our school used actually used to be was a very small seminary. And the only room that was big enough to serve as the quasi band room was the chapel. So that was my first classroom. But it had a metal roof, so in the afternoon, if the air conditioning wasn't working, it got very, very uncomfortable to be in there. So we would go out and play next to the cafeteria ladies, who always enjoyed it. It was fun. That was Venezuela. Yeah, that was Venezuela. And so that was one of those things. The more and more people I talk to, I think it's kind of a common feeling, but I definitely felt, especially in my first year there, that I learned way more than my students did. And I'm like I said, I'm assuming that's kind of a similar feeling a lot of first year teachers have. But I was so grateful for, I had so many colleagues that were aware that not only it was my first time overseas, but it was my first time, first year teacher. And everybody else at the school was, far more experienced. And they kind of just took me under their wing and helped out when they could. They were super supportive of all the performances, and that was not just for me. Like it was just kind of the nature of how the school worked. If somebody had something going on, everybody showed up. So like if there's a volleyball game, and the high school girls were playing volleyball, not only was all of the high school there, but all the middle school was there, and half of the elementary was there watching and cheering them on too. And I also remember one of my very, very good friends, still to this day, she taught first grade, and she had sent out an email to everybody that worked, all 26 of us on faculty, saying that her first grade class had just finished their unit on writing a book, and they were hoping to have some people to read to. And so anybody that didn't happen to have a class, if you're available, they would love it if you could come over and have the first graders read to you. And so I happened to not be teaching. I went over, and the high school principal was there. The middle school math teacher was there. The high school math teacher was there. The superintendent was there. And I remember that moment as thinking like there's a lot of challenges to this environment, but this is really cool to have, that level of community. And I definitely was a beneficiary of that because, it was kind of how I like to think I've modeled, how I think professionally. I try to help out my colleagues whenever I can. So it was a really cool experience. So how about the move to South Korea? Initially, it's fate or serendipity or some sort of not really sure. So in Venezuela, I was the youngest person on faculty, and one of my neighbors, her name was Jane. She taught fourth grade, and she was the oldest person on faculty. And to get around in Venezuela, you had to have a car. But she didn't want to deal with driving in Venezuela because it could be kind of stressful. It was kind of like a contact sport. So I had a car, and I gave her a ride to and from work every day. It was just the neighborly thing to do. And it didn't really think anything of it. We got along really well. She's super, super nice lady. Well, before she worked in Venezuela, she worked in South Korea. And so when it came around to my second year, when I was like really thinking like, oh, I want to look for a job that's more focused on just band, because that's what my passion is. There was this job listing at a school in South Korea, and it was the school that she had previously worked at. And so I asked her a little bit about the school, and she spoke highly of it and thought it would be a very good fit for me. And so I gathered my materials and submitted my application. And then what they didn't tell me is I got an email response saying, "Hey, we'd like to interview you." And this was back when Skype interviews were kind of unheard of. Like people were like, "What? You want to just talk online rather than meet in person?" That's a little. Now it's kind of almost more people get hired over Skype than they do in person, it seems now. But at the time it was a bit of a novelty. What I didn't know at the time was the day before I got an email from them, their administration had emailed Jane, and they said, "Hey, we got this, application from someone who looks like he's your colleague. Is he worth a look, or what do you think?" And she was super supportive. She's like, "Absolutely, you need to take a look at him. He's a great guy. I think he'd be a really good fit for the program." So it was, connections in Singapore helped open doors to interviews in Venezuela. Unbeknownst to me, connections in Venezuela helped open doors to interviews in South Korea. And the South Korea job was I got so lucky in terms of both, well, not just both, but location, student community, faculty community, and also timing. Because the school was growing, but it was not really established yet. So the job was a newly created job for middle school and high school band director. And they had also newly created a position for middle school and high school strings director. Because before that, they had kind of an instrumental person and a choir director. And the instrumental person was about ready to retire, and it was just not really set up the way, most of your listeners would assume, like you'd have beginning, intermediate, advanced level at middle school, same thing at high school. They kind of just had, if you were in grade 6 and played an instrument, that was when it worked in the schedule. So whether you had been playing violin for, 12 years, or if you got a clarinet yesterday, you're in the 6th grade instrumental class. So it was challenging, but they didn't really know any better. And this is another thing that I find out after the fact. The choir director was a Luther grad. And so she had been really instrumental in convincing the administration that, you need to find a band person and you need to find a strings person. And then they will help us actually set up the music department the way it should properly be set up. And they listened, and that was how the position was created. And so I moved to South Korea and was there for 5 years and had an absolutely amazing time. It was still one of my favorite places in the world. And ironically, I wasn't expecting to leave when I did. Is just the job where I am now, where I kind of started. The job in Singapore opened up, and I couldn't not apply. It was one of those. But that's definitely fast forwarding through a lot of interesting stories in Korea.
So tell me about the band in Korea. What was that job?
There we go. I think we had a little bit of lag there. So the best way I can describe the initial job in Korea, I think, is it was kind of like a sandbox, because my very first meeting with the high school principal, this is another one of those meetings I will never forget. They were talking about the initial budget, because they had asked me and the new strings director kind of about scheduling, and we'd really pushed to have, we want to have leveled groups. So kids that have been playing as best as you can do. Kids that have been playing for maybe 1 or 2 years in one class, and 2 or 3 or 4 years. This is in middle school, right? For in another group, and just have it so that there's a progression, and then we'll work with that as best as we can. And so they'd gotten the class schedules done pretty well. And so then he had a meeting with us about budget. And so it was me and the strings director, and he's, for context, this school, K-12, is about 1,200 students now. So, so the middle school was about 200 to 300 kids at that point. In the high school, it was not quite as big. It was still growing. The high school was probably about 300. And by the time I left, it was closer to like 450. So just for context for what size of school it was. And so the high school principal, love him to death because he was so honest. He said, all right, so I've put aside some money for you guys for a budget. I have no idea if it's like not enough at all, or if it's too much, or if he's like, please don't take it as an insult. He's like, we had to start somewhere. And then he also said, and he said also, before we start, and this is just for my knowledge, because I'm not too proud to admit what I don't know. He said, so we have an orchestra and we have a band. And he said, I don't understand the difference. And so this was kind of our starting point. And we had to, explain, a string orchestra versus a symphony orchestra versus a wind band. And he's like, okay, makes sense. And I remember our initial budget for the two of us, 612 instrumental music for the entire year. Keep in mind, this would be instruments, repairs, sheet music, everything all included, I think was $3,000. And we were like, and like at this point, I don't think we even had timpani. I think we had a bass drum, and this is why I still respect the guy. He's like, I can tell by your reaction that this is probably on the low side. And he said, so I'm not the, and we're like, yeah. He said, well, he's like, we hired you guys because you're the experts. He's like, if you could do me a favor, he said, take stock of what we have in terms of, instruments and music and like, what do we have? And he said, put together a list of everything. Like if you had everything you needed to run the program at a really high level, give me a list of everything you'd need and price it out as best you can. And so we did, and we came back 5 days later with I think the list was like $250,000 worth of stuff. Because it was like we didn't have timpani, like we didn't have basses, we didn't have tubas, we didn't have we had talked. We're like, okay, we can't go higher than the initial offer. So like, we're not like, and for the record, we did not put like contrabassoons or anything, there was not an English horn on the list. It was still just, they hadn't made the initial, I think we didn't even have enough music stands. Like we had enough for the classrooms, but not the practice rooms, this sort of thing. So
I was going to say, I think you could go one of two ways here. You could either go super high or super low, and you're probably better off just going on the high side.
Well, that ended up being the case. So we're like, well, here's our, we were like, well, here's our needs. And again, this was band and strings. And I can still remember the look on his face, because we kind of condensed it down into like a 1-page spreadsheet, itemized in categories for, sheet music and instruments and facility needs and this sort of thing. And he looked at it, he looked at the total, and he just kind of chuckled. And our school director at that time, his name was Rich Berner, and he just said, well, I hope Rich has a sense of humor. And he passed it up to the superintendent and the board of directors. And their response was honestly as good as we could have possibly hoped, because they said, well, this is a much bigger number than we had planned for. Like we need to spread this out over several years. And so then they asked us to prioritize. And by the time I left 5 years later, we had everything on that list.
Well, that's a happy ending. That's a great story.
And it was just one of those, like, what makes a good administrator questions is the people that listen to people that they understand that they're not experts at everything, so they're willing to listen, and they're willing to admit, like, well, this was a guess, or I really, like his initial number of 3,000, he was not invested. He's like, this is what we had left over, but we have to start somewhere. And he's like, okay, well, that was not the right number, and we'll go from what you guys are recommending. So
what did the program look like after the 5 years? I mean, can you kind of give me what it looked like the day you walked in, as far as what the bands were like versus what it was when you left?
I would say what the program looked like when I left is currently one of my kind of most it's hard to brag, but like I really am proud of what the program looked like when I left. So when I arrived, there were 2 middle school bands and 2 high school bands, and I was really insistent on that point with the administration. At the high school level, they had asked me multiple times. They said the numbers are really kind of small to justify 2 classes. Are you really sure you want to have, the 2 groups, or do you want them all in the same room? And I was really, really insistent on wanting to have a progression for the high school musicians as well. So we had, in high school, we had the concert band, which was non-auditioned, and then the wind ensemble, which was auditioned. And a similar thing in middle school, we had a non-auditioned symphonic band, and then the school mascot was the Phoenix. So we had the Phoenix band, which was like the auditioned group in middle school. And the numbers in high school were on the small side. The wind ensemble was definitely less than 20. It was, I want to say it was about 18, and 8 of those were flute players, which is super common in Korea. Flute and clarinet are both really, really popular instruments. The concert band was, it was somewhere at or around 30. I'm pretty sure it was over 30. And then middle school was kind of similar. The audition group was like in the 20s ish, and the younger group was slightly bigger. And then by the time I left, 5 years later, there were 3 middle school bands, grade 6, grade 7, and then still auditioned Phoenix band in grade 8. And most students passed that audition. And then in high school, the concert band, the year I left, I think was at 80. And the wind ensemble was at 60. And then we also had a middle school percussion class, a high school percussion class, AP music theory, middle school jazz band, high school jazz band. And no, I did not do all of that by myself, because my third year, we had enough growth where we hired a second full-time band director. And I think this was, I don't want to take all the credit, because like I was saying before, I really felt like I was super lucky in terms of the timing of when I arrived at, this was Korea International School, or KIS. My kind of perception of the school at that point, it was just about to turn 10 years old, and it really hadn't quite found its niche, because there's actually quite a few international schools in Korea, especially. There's a lot of American curriculum international schools, because there's such a demand for U.S. university degrees in Korea. So there was a lot of schools that sent students to the States, and then they would come back to work. And so there was a lot of competition. They were one of the newer schools, and there were like the DoD, or Department of Defense schools, because there's a fairly big U.S. military presence in South Korea. So there's also schools that the Department of Defense manages for the people that are stationed there long term. A lot of the DoD schools were known for being really good at athletics. Some of the other schools were really good at, quiz bowl. Some other schools were really known for their art program. And KIS, I think, was really hungry to be like known for something. And it's kind of now known as a music school. And that wasn't just because of me. I did play a role, but I also had really good colleagues. My colleague in choir was key in building that. My administration was super supportive of, they could have easily said in that initial budget meeting, or in any of the subsequent meetings, like, this is not a priority, or you're asking for too much, or, they could have easily gone different directions. But we had a very supportive community, absolutely incredible students, hardworking students. And just, I really think it was a hunger to be known for something, and I just got to be lucky enough to be one of the guys in charge of it. So I just want to ask about all of the schools. I looked up KISS, and I looked up the school in Singapore, and what can you tell me about the student demographics? How many of the students are American kids? How many are locals? I mean, what does that look like? I'm curious about that, the demographics. So I would say you can get the cookie cutter answer of every school is unique, and it's definitely true. Kind of in my experience, there's different categories that a school could fall under. So DoD schools, as I was talking about before, Department of Defense schools, they're almost entirely American, because it's deployed U.S. military and their families. So that's, you really think like American school, usually on a military base, like existing inside that kind of a bubble. Then you have schools that kind of you would almost consider like a host national school, and of all the schools that I've worked at, KIS would be the most like that. So that school, my students were 90% or more ethnically Korean. Several of them had two passports. They would have a U.S. passport and a South Korean passport, or they would have parents that had worked overseas, or one parent that's Korean and one that's American. But in terms of like just looking out over the ensemble in Korea, it was predominantly Korean. Venezuela was a little bit more mixed. We had about half of the students were local. And then that school's like primary reason for existence was actually it was an oil school, which there are also a lot of in the Middle East. But this was different in that the families that worked for oil companies that sent students to our school there, we weren't really dealing with the executives. It was actually like the geologists and the people that were out working in the field. So we had a lot of science-minded type people. And so it was like the Venezuelan crew and the Texas crew from a lot of people from Houston that were in Venezuela. And then you have schools like SAS where, I look out over my ensembles and it kind of looks like a UN meeting. The school has last number I heard, I think it was in the student body, we have 64, 65 or 66 different passports represented in the student body. And a lot of students also will have more than one passport. Like I would say maybe, like if I just use my wind ensemble here as an example, I want to say probably half of them would have a U.S. passport, but several of them that would not be their only passport. Other common passports would be we have a lot of Korean population here. A lot of people from China, a lot of people from India, a lot of people from Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Southeast Asian hub, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and then actually more than you would expect from Australia and New Zealand, and then a few from Germany, UK, a couple from France, kind of all over. So SAS, I would say, is definitely the most diverse school that I've worked at. And then there are others that are even more so, just given their location. So
yeah, I know that a lot of big cities in Europe, especially, have like a British American school, an American international school. Is there a British school in Singapore? I imagine there must be other schools. There's an Australian school, there's a Canadian school. There are several schools that run British curriculum. I don't think there's one called the British School, but there's two campuses of something called United World College, which has campuses in multiple countries. But that's more of a British IB curriculum. And they're kind of like, and then there are many other, some like for-profit international schools, some younger. There's Stamford American. Stanford Raffles is kind of a key figure in Singaporean history. So it's not Stanford like the university in California, but Stamford with an M, as in Memphis. And so that they're growing year by year. But SAS has been around since the 50s. Actually, SAS is older than Singapore as a country. The school was here back when Singapore was still part of Malaysia. So this is all really interesting. So I know we kind of jumped right to Singapore from Korea. So I assume that you had the opportunity to move, and it was something that was appealing because you knew the size of the school and the program.
Well, it was. I think I threw SAS off a little bit in the interview process because I was having. And we did actually skip over a few things in Korea, but I had the opportunity. Yeah, well, I think I'll need to just to kind of explain why it ended up being. It was not a kind of a slam dunk. For sure, I knew I wanted to leave because we had, like I said before, there were a lot of international schools in Korea, a lot of and so there were actually quite a few. Schools that had American style music curriculums. And I ended up getting to be quite good friends with many of them. And one of them, who was an absolute kind of key figure in helping unite all of the music teachers in Korea, his name was Ken Caldwell. And he was working at Seoul Foreign School at the time. And he and I got along really well. And we had kind of these pre-existing quasi music festival, like one day things where you could bring kids in and they'd have a local guest conductor who might be good or might not. But it was, if nothing else, it was a way like, oh, there's other people and a lot of us were based in Seoul. There's other people in town that are also teaching band kind of like you are. But at like my first one, like the music festivals were completely run by the athletic directors. So that creates issues when you have people that don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of, getting instrumentation sorted and what you need on stage and what you want to look for in a guest conductor. The music teachers weren't really consulted. And so Ken was kind of our ringleader, and I'll do the fast forward version. So I met him my first year. By the time I left in year 5, we had created KIMEA, the Korea International Music Educators Association. And from us meeting at a coffee shop in year 1, by year 5, we had a national honor orchestra, a national honor band, a national honor choir. We had our own music education conference. We had middle school honor band, middle school honor orchestra, middle school honor choir. We had just started an elementary choir festival. They were talking about adding jazz, but that was after I left. And he was so good because he in addition to being an amazing and Texas trained band director, so he knew his stuff. He was really good at, for better or worse to say, he could leverage bureaucracy really, really well. And so he knew the organization that the athletic directors were all a part of, that the governing board that decided that, all of the music festivals are going to be run by the same people that run the basketball tournament and the volleyball tournament and the soccer tournaments. So he had organized that all of us, a bunch of us, we were going to take a PD day, and we were meeting at the same location that this board meeting was happening. And he had proposed through his athletic director a mild change to the rules that literally just changed one sentence that said all music festivals will be managed and run by KIMEA. He literally just added a sentence to their it wasn't constitution, but they're basically their guidelines. And then, so all of us music teachers happened to be there. And then our principals were coming over and they're like, is this what you guys want to do for the music festivals? Does that make sense? And we're all like, yes, please do it. And so in one little vote, we had created KIMEA the week before, as an actual organization. And then the next week he'd organized this vote where they'd turned over control of all music activities to us. And so then when the athletic directors came in and said, hey, if they had any sort of anything, we're like, well, the rule book says that we're actually the ones that are supposed to be organizing this. And they're like, oh, okay. It was amazing. And so is this one, and then from that little victory, we were able to grow it into my last year, we were hiring guest conductors from universities in the United States. Because we had kind of built up, enough donations where we were able to fly people over. It was quite cool. So I had that, and it was just this amazing group of and we also had large group festival. So we were able to bring our kids, all of our kids, to play for judges and get feedback both at middle school and high school level for band, choir, and orchestra. It was quite cool. And people, had joked with me like, "Oh, you'll never leave Korea." And my response was, "Yeah, unless the SAS job ever opens, and that'll never happen." And now it happened. So it was, and so I went through the process because I just told myself, I can't not apply, because the worst case is I apply and I don't get the job and I'm totally happy here, but then it won't be like, oh, I wonder if. And then it kept I passed the first round of interviews. Well, I have to do the second. Oh, I passed the second. Oh, I have to do the third. Oh, I passed the third. Oh, they offered me the job. And then and SAS is, I think, kind of used to people saying yes immediately, because so many people really want to work here because it's a very good place to work. But they're like, well, we'd like to offer you the job. And my response was, well, can I have a week to think about it? And they're like, I guess, sure. Cause I had to sign my contract for the following year in Korea on, I think, December 1st. And this last round of hiring was happening right around Thanksgiving-ish time. And so I just really had to kind of, way. And I think in my gut, I knew it was the next challenge that I wanted to do, but I had to kind of live with the decision. And then I'm sure something your listeners can relate to is when you finally do make a decision to move on, there's nothing harder than going in and, telling your kids that, that'll be your last year there. And that was as difficult as I was expecting it to be. But they were supportive.
I'm looking at the Singapore American School now, and I can see why it was an easy decision for you to go there. It's like an exceptional place.
It is. It's kind of like La La Land in a lot of ways, where we are exceptionally well looked after and taken care of, and kids are kids anywhere, and it was. It's so funny because I had kids in Korea when I moved to Singapore. They were messaging me saying like, are they as good as we are? Do you like us more? And then the kids in Singapore after a year, they're like, do you like us better than your kids in Korea? And they wouldn't believe me when I'm like, look, I really enjoy working with all of you. So kids are kids, and that's where the focus should be. But just from a living perspective, Singapore is I've heard it described many ways. One kind of accurate description is people call it kind of Asia light. Because if people don't know, Singapore it's one of the busiest ports in the world, and it has kind of people from all over, and even Singaporean citizens. There's Singaporean Chinese, Singaporean Malay, Singaporean Indian, and then even on the national identity card that you have if you're a Singaporean citizen, it'll say C for Chinese, M for Malaysian, I for Indian, or O for other. But then everything in school and everything in business in the national language in Singapore is English. So it is super easy to live and get around and to make friends with locals. Whereas Korea, that was a lot more difficult just because the language barrier was very, very high. And it just made it harder to get to know people outside of the school community, which is much easier to do here in Singapore.
Sure. So tell me, how many music teachers are there at SAS?
In band, in high school, in like secondary, or all together?
All together. Just give me the rundown of the school.
So we have. Okay, so in high school, I do high school band and jazz, and then we have a high school strings director who also does guitar, and a high school choir director, and then we also have a joint program that we do, the three of us, with our drama teacher and our dance teacher, which we could almost do an entire episode on. But it's called our AET Advanced Topic Performing Arts course, and it's basically set up as a mini major. So like you can apply to join it as a clarinet player or a vocalist or a dancer or an actor or as a director. And we mix all the kids together, and we've done some work on the curriculum with Travis Cross at UCLA, and we have a couple of other like theater and dance colleagues at the university level, and it's just really, really cool. But it would take me way too long to explain the ins and outs of it. But they write a really big paper on what they want to use their art for, like why they consider themselves artists and not just student artists, but like we really want them to start thinking about, you as an artist, how do you want to use your music or your dance or the theater to impact the world? And they also get a chance to do a senior recital. And like for our musicians, we have them do some music theory courses and music history courses. We're using online courses like through Coursera and Yale and Berkeley and that sort of thing. And then they also do collaborative things with the musicians and the dancers and the theater people all getting together to work on a production. It's really cool. So that's at the high school. At the middle school, there are two more band directors, a strings director and a choir director. There's two in band because of the beginning instrumental thing being what I'm sure your listeners know, being the most important, most difficult, and most blessed job that exists is the people that teach beginning band. I've done it I've done I would say a passable job, and Tracy Craig, the lady that we have teaching beginning band here, is a legend. It's like watching some sort of sorcerer. It's amazing to see. So I'm super lucky to have her. And then down at elementary, which is our campus is quite large. They're down kind of on the other wing, and there are, I believe at last count, there are 6 of them, six full-time elementary music teachers. It might be 7. It might be 7 now, actually.
How many students at the school?
Total,
how many students at the school?
A total from our early years program all the way up to senior is 4,000. So we're pretty big. Now, not big for maybe like a U.S. school district, but the next largest international school on a single campus that I'm aware of would be about 2,500. So we're kind of this like I said, a little bit of an anomaly.
What does the program look like as far as how's your high school band organized? Let's say that I was a 14-year-old moving to Singapore and I was joining your high school band. What would my journey look like?
So if you're coming in from another school and you're coming in as a 9th grader, in 99% of the cases, you'll end up in concert band, which is a band that I try to protect, and I try to just have 9th graders in it. We do have exceptional cases where we'll have a student that will audition up to the middle band, and in absolutely, all 3 band directors here have to agree that it's the right decision. We have one student this year who, as a 9th grader, is in wind ensemble, but she's been playing flute since it seems like before I was born, and she's like off doing international flute competitions, and a super special case. But for the average student, come in as a 9th grader, it would be concert band, and then you'd have the opportunity to audition for a symphonic band at the end of symphonic band or wind ensemble at the end of your freshman year. Most students would then move up to symphonic, and then depending on the student and depending on their workload and their interest, some students choose to stay in symphonic, because it's less pressure. They have other priorities. They might be super invested athletes. They might be taking however many AP classes, or music might be not their primary focus. And then wind ensemble is the top group, which is mostly juniors and seniors. And then we have jazz as an opportunity. I also teach a jazz improvisation class, which is an interesting setup that I actually inherited, and I was very uncertain as to whether or not I would like how it's set up when it was explained to me. But it actually works fairly well. So basically, it's a semester-long class, and it's students in wind ensemble that want to really study jazz improvisation, just more in depth than you would just get in the after-school jazz band. They really want to look into jazz theory and really practice improv and get some combo experience, and some of them get some arranging experience. The trade-off is they're in wind ensemble, but when wind ensemble rehearsal meets, they're not there because they're in jazz improv at another time. The way we kind of make it work is every student at our school in high school has a free block. Most of the jazz kids, their free block is during wind ensemble. So we will once a month, we tend to have Monday night rehearsals with wind ensemble. We have everybody, jazz and non-jazz, will come in for 2 to 3 hours, just so everyone's together and making sure that literature everyone's kind of on the same page. And then as we get closer to performance times, there'll be times when jazz improv, instead of having jazz improv, they'll switch over and they'll play with wind for the full time. So it's a little bit of a headache for first semester for the actual wind ensemble, but it does make the jazz band stronger, and it allows those kids to kind of pursue in a little bit more structured environment the jazz side of things, which is kind of cool.
Hey there, everyone. My name is Ann Molesky, and I'm the host of the Anna Krusick Podcast, another podcast in the Muted Network. It's my mission to help music teachers be more purposeful, sequential, and joyful in each and everything they do as teacher musicians. Join me every Thursday as I share tips, tricks, and meaningful conversations with other music teachers about how to make the general music classroom more intentional and impactful for both you and your students.
All right, Jay, let's get into these final questions here. And so, where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
I'm imagining a lot of your guests have similar answers to this one. At least I kind of hope they will. But for me, the most important competition, and I tried to model this with my students as best as I can, is you're competing with your old self. And for me personally, that's like, I'm a runner, but the only times I care about were how fast I ran my last race. And I try to do similar things with the kids in music. It's like, and again, we're a little bit isolated here. Like, we don't have currently, competitions where we're going to as a whole group. So it's not like we're trying to, win the division championships or win nationals. But I try to tell the kids, it's, what did we sound like at the last show? What did we sound like last week? What did you sound like at the last show? What did you sound like last week? What did you sound like last year? And we have, our recording pass-offs and stuff that we do in class. And I often encourage the kids to go back and listen. And a lot of times they're surprised. They're like, oh, I was really hard on myself, but then I listened to myself last year and I've actually made a lot of progress. So I think competition with yourself is super important, and you always want to be pushing to be the best person, the best musician you can be personally, and same is true for the ensemble. And in terms of unhealthy competition, my honest answer is I have not been exposed to a lot of it, just given the nature of my job being so isolated is not the right word, but it's just the nature of it's different. So I don't find myself in direct competition with other programs as much as I'm guessing a lot of your listeners do.
All right, Jay. So how do you find a work-life balance in your career as a music teacher?
The best advice I ever heard on balance in career and work life, I heard from Dr. Mallory Thompson at Northwestern when I was at one of her symposiums. And I don't think it's a new idea, but I do think possibly from my perspective, one of the reasons I remember it is just because who was saying it, because I respect her so much. But someone had asked this question of her, and her response was that balance is not a noun. Balance is a verb, and it's something you're always going to have to address, and you're always going to have to adjust. And she also said you have to also realize that there are times in life when you need to be out of balance. Her example was when you're in grad school, which I think makes sense. If any of her grad students are listening, I think they know what she's talking about. But she's like, look, you have to realize there are going to be weeks, concert weeks, competition weeks, where in order for things to work the way that we want them to, things have to be a bit out of balance, and you have to be aware of that. And you have to be self-aware enough to realize that out of balance is a choice in this moment, and then being able to then readjust it back. And so, and I've told this to my students, balance is a verb. It's not something you find, it's something you adjust constantly.
All right. So this question is really interesting in the context of what you're doing as an international teacher doing band. But what are the challenges facing music education, and how do we best meet them?
Well, I had I think it was Dr. Rob Taylor at UBC that we were talking kind of about this. And the word I'm going to use is relevance. And I'm using it carefully because and I'm guessing the majority of your listeners think that the core lessons and the core values that we can instill with an ensemble music experience in our students, I think, are always going to be relevant. The idea of competing with your former self, of being part of something bigger and doing something bigger than you could ever do by yourself. Teamwork, accountability, all of the anyone who's had to advocate for a program where, they're like, well, we have the music, but what else do you have? We've all been trained in the secondary benefits of experience in music. But also I've found with the kids more and more, they want to perform with a purpose, or like it's not like and I don't know. I don't think it's just my students. It sounds like it's been happening to a couple of other directors as well. But it's like, does this concert on a smaller scale? Does this concert have a broader theme? Is this being connected? But also, like, are we? We've talked about doing benefit concerts. I know Dr. Taylor recently did a show kind of focused around climate change and connecting things to student advocacy, and and I think kind of meeting. There's a lot happening all over the planet, and a lot of people are worried about a lot of things. I've had a lot of students are anxious. And so having those conversations and using music to kind of speak to bigger issues, I think is something that we have in spades. But I don't know if, at least for me, it's not something I've always been really good at doing. And that's kind of my current project is to try to create performances with a deeper meaning than just the literature. Which I would love to just, we've just got the literature and it's amazing, but I'm finding I'm having to connect it to more things to really get the student buy-in.
All right, Jay, I could give you a time machine and set it to the afternoon of your high school graduation. What advice would you offer to yourself? Learn
Spanish, like for real. That would be super helpful. I think going into university, the person I would really like to talk to is the person who just came out of university. And I would say two things to me that's just about to start teaching, like before my very first day of teaching, is reach out to the people that you admire and respect sooner, like email, letter, whatever. Because there were so many people I admired from afar for so long that it took. I was just kind of scared to meet them. Dr. Thompson being a really good example, and Travis Cross and Tim Robley and Rob Taylor and all these just amazing people that I've gotten to meet. I just wish I had met them sooner. And then actually a very specific piece of advice is start doing chamber music sooner. It is the single best thing, and I'm not taking credit because if you remember when I was talking about in Korea, we hired a second band director. His name is Mike Shirk, absolutely amazing teacher, and his first thing when he came in was, and he rightly pointed out that our biggest missing piece was we needed chamber music, and it was the single best decision we made that year and every subsequent year because it teaches so many things and creates such more literate independent musicians. I just wish I would have, I do it every year now. It's amazing. And if I would say to your listeners, if you're thinking about trying and dabbling with a chamber music unit or even a week or 2 weeks, like do it. You will not regret it. It's a lot of work. There's a lot of faith. You have to trust that the kids will meet your expectations, but they'll surprise you, and your ensemble will thank you in the end.
If you had a choice, what would be the final work for wind ensemble or band that you would conduct, and why?
Mine is Maslanka 4. I love Lincolnshire and I mean all the classic band standards. Love them, but I don't know. For me, Maslanka, the first time I heard that piece in full, I feel like I had to pick my brain up off the floor. It was so many things and so complicated and surprising and strange techniques and little bits of jazz and epic and just absolutely amazing piece of music. And if I could be in front of that and leading that piece of music one time, that would be absolutely amazing. Not something I'm currently planning on being able to do, but you never know. There's a great YouTube video out of the group at Northwestern doing their recording of Maslanka 4, and it's not the actual full-length recording. It's kind of this mini documentary of their weekend of the recording, and I've shown that to my students in the fall of almost every year. Primarily because there's this one clip where they do this smash cut where it's like take 2, take 3, take 34, take 56, take 95. And it was, and like, I can always see the look on my kids' face when they're just like, oh, they're like really serious about getting this right. And it's like, there's times when, even some of the best musicians we know, it's like, you've really got to keep pushing. I think the clip's like 9 minutes long. I think it's called The Making of Rising. If people want to look it up, if they haven't seen it, it's great.
All right, Jay, is there anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote?
Nothing personally. I mean, there's, if anyone happens to be in Singapore and wants to catch a show, let me know. I doubt it'd be interesting to see what listener crossover we have there. If anyone's in Singapore and is listening, we could, meet up and talk band. But I would say if you've kind of heard something in this conversation that makes you want to ask more questions about teaching music overseas, I would say look up AMI. It's the Association for Music in International Schools, amionline.org. I think there might be a dash in there. You can kind of take a look at that website. And then please reach out to me. I think that's our next question is if people want to get in touch with me, you can just email me at work. It's just the letter J and then my last name, Lundgren, Londgren, at sas.edu.sg. Just reach out. I'd be happy to talk band, happy to talk, the overseas life. Mark, if there's other people overseas, if you'd be interested in talking to some other people that teach band overseas, I've got a couple of names of some people you should definitely talk to. We've got some pretty cool teachers over here and in Europe and in North Asia and all in Middle East and all over. So
how can people get in touch with you?
The best ways, you can email me at work. Like I said, the letter J and then my last name, Londgren, at sas.edu.sg. Just send me an email there. You can find me on Facebook if you want to. There seems to be basically no students left on Facebook anyways. Most of my friends on Facebook are band directors. So you can look me up there if you want to. And definitely happy to talk band, happy to talk international teaching if you've got questions or also if you're a composer. Also I love talking to composers too. Happy to maybe work on some collaborations too, just starting one and always interested in starting some more. So
Jay, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you as well. This has been fantastic.